Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. So a story has come out that Xana Kernodle's fingers were quote-unquote nearly severed, but there's a problem with this whole sort of new bit of evidence, I guess. I'm sure the victims had defensive wounds, but I doubt whether any almost lost their fingers. Firstly, because it's hard to do. There are a lot of bones, ligaments, and cartilage in fingers. Secondly, if she was putting up such a fight that she was repeatedly holding onto the knife, why didn't Xana scream? And you could argue that why didn't any of the victims scream if they were experiencing pain? Well, the issue is if you, at the moment that you're experiencing pain, it's actually going to be difficult to breathe, to never mind scream or say something. If you are going to have difficulty breathing, then you're not going to be screaming. So the issue with the finger injury is you would imagine that she was able to fend off the initial, and I realize this is quite a graphic image that I'm conveying, but if she's fending off the attacker with her hands, that means there's a period where her torso, her chest, her lungs are not injured. And so that then raises the question, why didn't Xana scream? Does that make sense? And there is no mention of a scream from D or B. And the one mention there is of a scream from the one chef. I'm not sure if I accept that as credible. Nobody else said they heard anything. And even the recording on the Ring doorbell camera doesn't mention anything about a scream. And so I would imagine if there was this opportunity to fend off the attack with hands that lasted for any length of time, then you would have a scream. And the fact that there's no scream leads me to question that whole thing. Does that make sense? Before we get to the rest of this episode, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind I'm going to be doing the actual episode, The Greatest Story Never Told, following this one, so look out for that. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button. And let's get started. So I think if we think critically about this whole issue, the other aspect that I don't think is reliable is that it's coming from the same source. So the same source behind the severed fingers claim also has suggested Ethan was found in the doorway. It may be that Ethan was attacked in the doorway, but really none of this makes sense given the version D gave to the cops. This same source apparently also spoke of a neck wound. That's three separate claims, all of which maximize the sensational nature of the crime. And whenever that happens, I do think we've got to be careful, because also these three separate claims from the same person, all three are contradicted by the probable cause affidavit in combination with the coroner's report. And that is why I tend to not be convinced it's true. And obviously where we are now is there was a huge amount of information that was coming out. And then suddenly there's kind of been crickets, kind of been silence. And obviously we want to know some of the details. But then that creates this sort of carrot scenario where some people have information and are not allowed to say anything because of the gag order. But then there's also the whole situation of there's this demand, there's this insatiable demand from the media and from social media. And then some people want to satisfy that demand, right? And it's not necessarily true. And so you had that situation with the Mad Greek restaurant where you can't tell for sure whether something is one way or the other. I tend to agree that Brian did visit that restaurant, but you just kind of have the situation of there's this thirst for information, and then there are people not saying anything, and then there are some people saying something, but is it reliable? And that is kind of the setup that we are going to go through for the next couple of months until we get to trial, where some people will come forward, but it's going to be hard to confirm things either way. And that's why we're going to have to use logic. I also think it's becoming clearer, and this is really quite disturbing, especially after what we heard regarding people's responses to Coburg at the student union, the responses of those 3 female students. I kind of get the feeling that Coburger would have killed everyone in that house had he had the opportunity, right? If the dog wasn't barking, for example, if Ethan wasn't there that night, if the suspect didn't have to fend off a male attacker, a stronger male attacker, then I think the victim count could easily have gone up to 5, 6, right? And that is quite scary. That idea that, the fact that there were survivors and a dog is something, but I think it was the suspect's intention to kill everybody in that house. And if you think about that whole idea we've had since the beginning that this was a targeted attack, I think it was a targeted attack in the sense that the house was targeted. But this is actually because it looks like the suspect had a score to settle, not just with one person, but with the collective. And that raises a really crucial point. This was a symbolic crime. Let me say that again. This was a symbolic crime. And as soon as you get symbolic actions, like whether it's to do with war or whatever, then you're going into a very horrible area, because now someone simply represents you are not directing your ire at a specific person. You're simply directing it at a representative, and that can be infinite, right? Because feelings are infinite. So if you think about Chelsea, who didn't like him staring at her and her leaving with her friends, the suspect's gripe isn't just with Chelsea, it's with her friends as well. And this seems to be how the victims were chosen inside the funhouse as well. Mostly indiscriminate, but in a way all symbolic. Have you thought about that? Have you thought about this is a very unusual case and a very unusual crime, because the victims weren't chosen in a specific way necessarily, but because they symbolized something to the killer. They symbolized the reason for him being isolated, right? And that's simply something we don't see in most high-profile cases. There may be some symbolic aspects to it, but the victims are invariably chosen for specific and personal and direct reasons. They have a direct bearing on the killer. Think about Jodi Arias, Casey Anthony, Scott Peterson, Chris Watts, and then the pending cases of Alex Murdaugh, Laurie Vallow, Caitlin Armstrong. All of it is very specific and very personal, it appears to be. So can you see how the perpetrator in this case is a very different animal, is a lot more like an incel and a mass killer than, for the lack of a better word, an ordinary killer. It also suggests what we are dealing with here is someone with an unusual amount of psychopathy. How do we explain this? Do you know what I mean? This idea that, well, I'm not really getting what I want out of life, so I'm going to kill indiscriminately in order to make a point, right? It's kind of a cerebral, symbolic thing, and it just seems totally over the top. It seems totally unnecessary. It seems totally excessive. Other people have ways of making their presence felt without doing that. And so how do we explain this unusual, this extreme amount of psychopathy? What do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.